Welcome. Today, I'm very honored, very pleased to have Patrick Spain in the Making It Real podcast. Patrick Spain is the co-founder of many exciting ventures, starting his first venture, Hoovers.com, that many people know. He IPO'd Hoovers, then he started HighBeam, then he started Newser, and most recently he co-founded and is the CEO of First Stop Health, where he introduced telemedicine service already in the, I think, was it around 2011, 12-ish? Right now, it's a huge thing, obviously, but you were as well one of the pioneers there. So such a great honor and pleasure to have you here today.
It's a pleasure to be here virtually on, and I always love chatting with you.
Wonderful. Well, Patrick, there are many people out there that think about starting their own companies and making it real. They have an idea. And so what was your personal way into the entrepreneurship world? When did you decide to co-found a company?
That was in 1990, and a friend of mine from college called me up and said, I'm going to start a book publishing company, and it's going to be one-page profiles of companies. This is what eventually became Hoover's. And the more he described it, the more it sounded to me like something that ought to be online. In 1990, there was no internet, no web. There was the predecessor of the internet, DARPANet. But there was CompuServe. And so I was convinced that what we had would be interesting for CompuServe, which many of your viewers won't remember because they weren't born yet. But CompuServe was once upon a time the dominant online service in the world. It had 1 million users before anybody had more than a couple 100,000. So that's how we got going. And I got interested because I thought there was an opportunity to take this book that he wanted to create online.
And were you very convinced there about that it will work no matter what? How did you approach it? Did you work at another company previously and then quit everything to make it real?
Exactly. I spent 10 years working for a Fortune 500 company that was serially owned by Dow Jones, Rolls-Royce, and then a technology conglomerate that no longer exists and no one knows its name. So, but I learned a lot there. I learned how to do business plans. I learned how I took a 6-week accounting course in law school. That's all the accounting I knew. I knew a lot more about accounting and budgeting and what have you. Having done that, one of the advantages of today is that I spent 10 years learning the ropes of a technology business, and you can do it much faster today. And you can get a lot of those skills and bring them in much quicker. And so you don't have to do a 10-year apprenticeship anymore before you can become an entrepreneur. And I think that's wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Remember as well, there's always the typical challenge of leaving behind a nice salary. And so to just say, okay, now we're going to start something there. What was that decision like? What gave you the confidence that, oh yes, this will work no matter what?
Well, to be honest, it was not so much about this will work no matter what, but I was tired of working for a large company and not having control over decisions that I wanted to have control over that affected the operations of that company. And I simply said, okay, it's time for me to strike out on my own. And, I went from making $150,000 a year to $40,000 a year. And there was a lot of sacrifice and hardship associated with that. But I was convinced that a long-term trend that's occurred ever since is the democratization of any kind of information and even any kind of service. And so when we started Hoover's in 1990, the sources for business information were primarily companies, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, Barron's, Dow Jones, places like that. And the information was expensive. It costs hundreds of dollars. And in many cases, thousands of dollars a year to get access to it. And it was largely available in print in a library. And so we thought there might be an opportunity to democratize information. So if you really needed to know about General Motors, we had everything you needed to know on a page. We had a little bit of its history. We said what it did. We had its brands. We had its brief financials. And so it was a great introduction. So if you're a student, and you're trying to figure out the history of the automotive industry, you can read our General Motors and Ford and Chrysler and other profiles and learn about it. And then investors were also interested because it was a quick way to understand maybe not General Motors that we all know about, but a company you're less familiar with. And then salespeople became interested. And ultimately, that's where Hoover's ended up, which was in serving salespeople so they'd be smarter about their potential clients.
Mhm. Wonderful. Imagine now you have the idea, okay, let's take information from a professional source and democratize that. If we look at the supply side to get that information, was that hard to convince then, I guess, the data gatherer that you can be a new form of distribution for them?
Well, we did license financial information from Standard and Poor's initially. And then we were able to replace that with the electronic version of the SEC feed. But essentially, we had writers, and we asked the writers to go out and read about General Motors, look at all the articles in Forbes and Fortune to understand this company, look at the news to understand what's going on now, and please write a profile of this company. So it was largely a human exercise, except for the numerical side, which we were able to automate from pretty early on. And I mean, that's how we put it together. And the other thing was, when you democratize something, you have to make it much more accessible. So if you were to open a Standard and Poor's, if they still exist, it's a really, really, really boring description of General Motors. And when we talk about General Motors, we talk about the significant events in General Motors history that made it what it was. And so it was much more fun to read. And as you may recall, we always started each profile with a pun, and that caught people's attention. It became our voice, and people weren't used to voice in pure information products. And so it was the way we distinguished ourselves and built our brand. I like to tell a story about 5 years in. I'm sitting at, it's now .com time, and I'm sitting at a big event in Aspen with a bunch of people sitting around. And I'm sitting next to some guy, and I say, "Oh, I'm the CEO of Hoover's." He said, "Oh yeah, I know Hoover's." I said, "I'm also, one of the co-founders." He said, "Well, that's not possible. Hasn't Hoover's been around for 75 years or so?" So once you kind of get a brand and you have some authority, and one of the ways we got authority was, even though we wanted to democratize it, when I got Hoover's on the Bloomberg terminal, we had legitimacy. So associating your brand with other brands, having other brands vet your brand, was one of the ways that we made Hoover's important.
And how did you get on this distribution sides? How could you get into volume distribution there? I imagine that on one side, then you license some information, you give it a personal tone, you have your own writer. So I imagine a bit of a cost there to start the company. So you would very quickly need quite some distribution to recoup some of the cost to produce the information.
Well, initially we published books, so we made some money on the books, not much, but again, in trying to get online, I told you I wanted to go online because of CompuServe. CompuServe turned me down 3 times because they said, "We don't know who you are. You're a small company in Texas. You're not Moody's. You're not Standard and Poor's. So go away." So then I got on Bloomberg, and they still weren't that interested. And then there was a small competitor to CompuServe known as America Online. And I went to them when they had 60 employees. I showed up for my noon appointment, and I left at 8 that evening with a deal. And everybody at AOL, I had 30 people in the room at the end, and Steve Case kept walking in and walking out. And the challenge was to convince them that the consumers that they believe they served had an interest in business as well. I said, "Well, are they students? Do they have jobs? And are they investors? We can help." So there's a whole combination of hitting all of the places. AOL didn't care that we were on Bloomberg, but a lot of other people did. And so this combination of getting your brand associated with other brands and using emerging players, and as everyone knows, AOL surpassed and then ended up buying CompuServe. So, and it was kind of my second choice because I wasn't aware of AOL when we started.
How important is market timing there, would you say? Like whenever, and we're going to look at then now quickly at your next ventures, how important is it to be like really early in this, what we then looking back became really big waves? Are you looking for that?
Well, you're looking for something that you believe is going to emerge. It's very hard to get the timing right. And so what I would say is we would have gone out of business had the internet not come along. And we didn't anticipate the internet. What we anticipated was a connected world. I thought it would be CompuServe, AOL, and dozens of other entities, and they might one day eventually interconnect. But we saw democratization and electronic distribution as the future, and we put a bet in there. But we had the last 3 years until the web, or really the Mosaic browser, was invented by Mark Andreessen in order to really hit it big. If Andreessen had decided to go to school for 2 more years, we would have been in trouble.
So as well, being lucky as well at times is important entrepreneurship to some extent. What would have been plan B if Mark Andreessen and Mosaic wouldn't have shown up?
Go back and work for a big company, probably. I don't know, but I don't actually think so. Again, we would have just struggled longer, but we got lucky, and luck is incredibly important. And the luck part is timing. I mean, you have to have a good idea, and it has to be looking at macro long-term trends. When you can implement that idea is a challenge. So we were in telemedicine relatively early on, but not as early on as Teledoc, which started in 2008 and really struggled for a very long time convincing people that this telemedicine was a worthwhile benefit. And in 2011, when we started, it wasn't much more advanced. We still had an uphill battle. Anybody who'd ever had telemedicine, no one used it, and they were convinced that it wasn't anything anybody wanted. And so the magic of what we did with First Stop Health was to say, well, you kind of have to educate and you have to convince people that this has some benefit. And so we focused our entire effort on engagement and education. And the industry, when we first brought our first product out in 2013, had about a 2% utilization rate, and we were striving to get a 25% utilization rate. And most people thought we were crazy. And in our first year, we got a 34% utilization rate simply by requiring our clients to allow us to talk with their employees about the benefits of this.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. That's then the fourth venture. If we maybe take the other ventures as well, HighBeam Research and Newser, do you have a common theme as well, how you look for these opportunities? What's next? Is there something common that you would, having started now 4 companies?
Well, we sold Hoover's, and I felt I probably ought to do something else. And so I was interested in the nexus of information and technology, which even when we sold Hoover's in 2003 was still a very emerging kind of area. And so one of the things about startups is that the first 3 years are hell on wheels. I mean, you're trying to figure out how to do something. You're trying to figure out how to do something that everybody else does differently. And everybody else is telling you, you can't do it that way. And so I decided, well, what if I skip that and buy something that's out there, but not working right? And so there was a publicly traded company called Infonautics that had gone into bankruptcy. And I noticed that a Canadian company had purchased it. And so I called them up and said, why the hell do you purchase this company? He said, oh, we wanted the shell, the public shell, because we wanted to go public. So what are you going to do with this archive you have of several 100 million articles? Oh, probably just run it into the ground, wait till people go away. I said, well, what do you think you'll make out of that? He told me, I said, I'll pay you that for it right now. So I bought that. And that was a much easier process in one way, in that I had a base. I had several $1 million of revenue coming in, even though it was declining very quickly. So the goal was to try and redo the technology so it was less expensive, and refocus the marketing. They thought all of their clients were students, and they were charging $10 a month. And I was pretty sure that students won't pay $10 a month for information because that would mean less pizza and beer.
Absolutely.
And so we discovered when we looked into who our clients were, they were small businesses, and they couldn't afford Factiva and LexisNexis and some of the more expensive ones. And so we were a great resource for small businesses trying to do research. And at the time, a lot of the internet was still private. I mean, as it is today, you had to subscribe to see it, like with the New York Times. And so we were able to offer them 100 million articles from thousands of different newspapers, magazines, journals. And it was a nice research tool. And we discovered that $30 was a pretty fair price per month to charge a small business to get that kind of access. And so we built it up and sold it. And it ended up, interestingly, back in the education community.
Wonderful. Did you validate before buying it that the distribution could work, or was it more knowing the market and having this intuition and that it should work, and somewhat like that in someone in the space at some price point that would people would buy that and it would make up like significant revenue?
Well, there are tens of millions of small businesses in the US, and they were largely ignored for a long time. So one of the macroeconomic trends was a lot of companies were trying to figure out how to help small businesses move quicker in their areas by providing some combination of technology and humans to support them. And so it was somewhat intuitive. They wouldn't show me who their customers were when I bought it, but I was pretty sure who they were, and I was right. And so we were able to develop that and then again sell it back into the educational community. And they added another company that was focused on students, and so they were able to have both sides of it.
Wonderful. So second down, two to go. So successfully built another company, another entrepreneurial venture. You made it real. You sold it successfully. How did you decide on the third venture, Newser?
Well, a longtime friend of mine, a journalist called Michael Wolff, kept telling me, look, you have these thousands and thousands of stories. And I told him we get 40,000 news stories a day. He said, we should go into the news business, which was the business he was in. And I said, but Michael, there's already too much news on the internet. And he'd say, yeah, okay. And then he'd come back to me 6 months later, say the same thing. And then finally, he said, you know what, we're going to create less news. And I said, what do you mean by that? He said, well, we're going to do capsules of news. We're going to be the USA Today of the internet. And it seemed like a smart thing. USA Today revolutionized the newspaper industry by making things smaller, more compact, and more colorful. And that's essentially what we did with news. Is we created squares, 9 squares, 12 squares if you wanted, that you could see, and then you could click on them and read, again, editorial content that we created about the news of the day, both the things you need to know and the things that are kind of fun to know. And we got a lot of immediate traction, but the problem with the news industry is that it was headed downhill. Even though we were in the digital side of it, most of the news industry, the news industry today is less than 1/2 the size it was 10 years ago. Because of technology and a lot of, the monopoly that newspapers had in particular areas went away. When Craigslist, you could list anything you wanted on Craigslist and it didn't cost you anything. And so I would say it was definitely a mistake to go into an industry that was not growing, and that we have a product, the company still exists, it's profitable, but it never got to scale. And so it never met my expectations of being able to become a dominant player in the news industry. And we came out at the same time as Huffington Post, BuzzFeed, and some companies like that. They invested hundreds of millions of dollars to get to $100 million of revenue. And in the end, I'm not sure how successful you could say any of them were. And we just stayed small, and we're that way today, and we're profitable and employ about just over a dozen people. And I haven't figured out what to do with it yet. So I would call that not a failure, but not a screaming success.
Mm-hmm. And which is fascinating too, because oftentimes people love to learn from the success stories, the big success stories, but you learn as well a lot from the kind of these walks of life where you feel like, oh, right, we cannot really scale it. Maybe we would have the initial idea to scale it. It works somehow. What would you say are like a few core lessons learned there if you're in a position like that where you feel, oh, the market is rapidly declining, it's very hard, there's a lot of offerings, the monetization piece we learned, Craigslist that was the classified ad site showing paid ads that people could post on these properties. That's not working too well anymore. What would you say are like the core lessons learned there?
Don't go into markets that are shrinking. economically. I mean, it's not that people wanted news less, they still wanted news more. And they wanted more news, and they wanted it from diverse sources. But the means of supporting that, which was traditionally advertising targeted at a local market where you were a near monopoly, had disappeared. And so we all ended up doing advertising on the internet and having Google and other ad networks support us. And the fact is that you need gigantic volume for that to work. And Huffington Post, for example, was able to make that work. We weren't, because we didn't have the same kind of capital that they were able to attract at the time. And in the end, the news industry is still in a sad state. And there's not much you can do. So I would say don't go into industries that are declining, even if you think you can turn something around. There are companies that know how to do turnarounds and make these things work, but you at least need a static industry, and news was massively declining in terms of its revenue.
Mm-hmm. Would you maybe as well suggest to founders then to focus actually on really fast growing markets? Does that help a lot, having been in different markets now? Or is it just the minimum requirement is it shouldn't shrink?
Well, I'll tell you why I went into my next market, First Stop Health. It's the largest market in the United States. It's almost a $4 trillion market now, which is 20% of GDP in the US. And it's also one of the most wasteful and inefficient markets. No one disagrees that at least $1 trillion of that money is wasted and misspent. And so what I saw was an opportunity, and this is not unlike Hoover, it's an opportunity to say, okay, here's this big industry out here that is charging a lot of money to a small number of people to get a pretty good product out, but not a product that appealed to tens of millions of people, but to tens of thousands of people. And so when I looked at healthcare, I said, well, it's broken. Everybody knows it's broken. And the core of, and I apologize in advance for your European audience, it's very hard to understand American healthcare because it's unique. I think only Singapore and maybe Brazil have purely employer-provided healthcare. And so what you have is employers aren't very smart, for the most part, about that benefit, about the healthcare industry and how to do it. So they typically hire a carrier, United Healthcare, Aetna, Blue Cross, to provide this benefit, either as a fully insured benefit or as self-insured by the employer. And then you have the providers on the other side, which are typically big hospitals and all the independent physicians. And neither of them have any economic incentive to reduce costs. And so employers are just used to having everything go up 5% a year, faster than that in recent history. And so it was kind of one of these very frustrating things, and we weren't delivering value. And so what I said is, I can't be part of that employer-carrier nexus, which is where most telemedicine lives. The big players in the industry all work with the big carriers in the industry. We wanted to go directly to employers because I view employers as rational players. If I go to an employer and say, look, I can reduce your overall healthcare costs by 1% to 2% by introducing telemedicine to keep people out of ER, out of urgent care, and to make their lives more convenient for them, to waste less time going to and from a physical doctor when you don't really need to be examined, which is probably a third of all of the consults in the United States, about 1.2 billion per year, don't require a physical exam. And so those are now very rapidly, driven in part by COVID, moving into the virtual world, whether it's with us or with a big hospital practice.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. So you saw this opportunity there, being not from the medical space. How did you then got started? How did you make it real? Coming from this observation, seems the market is extremely broken. It would be definitely worth it to fix it. No, so not just as well to build a for-profit, fast-growing company, but as well really to help society to fix this fundamental issue. How did you get that one started?
Well, I didn't know anything about company information. I didn't know anything about news, and I didn't know anything about. Well, I knew a little bit about business archives, HighBeam, and so the fun is learning about a new industry. And so it can't just be about making money. It's really about what's fun. And I will say that my first three companies were largely opportunistic. my friend Gary Hoover said, hey, I'm going to publish this book. And I said, hey, let's put it online. We did. Was I devoted to the notion that salespeople should have better tools? No. So the first three were kind of interesting things. I learned a lot, enjoyed the people in the industries. When you're in information, there's this kind of higher mission of making people smarter. And the healthcare industry is different. We're dealing with something that each of us has to have in order to have full opportunity in life. And as with so many people, I ended up in healthcare because I ran into the healthcare industry in an unpleasant way in my family about 15 years ago, and I found it wanting. And so I wanted to see what part of it I could fix. I couldn't fix that particular part, which was advocacy and navigation, because there wasn't a big play for it back then. But I could fix this issue of why waste your time going, spending 2 hours out of your day to go see a doctor when you don't need to. And why, because it's midnight and your doctor isn't around, should you have to go to the ER if you have an uncertain illness that worries you? And so we decided to try and fix that problem. And the entire focus of our company is still delivering a delightful experience, primarily to our patient, but to all of our constituencies, also to the employers, to the doctors who work for us, to the brokers who are our interface with the employers. And our whole focus is on making the patient well and happy. Mm-hmm. And when you can, and that's a higher mission. That's a higher mission. It's like feeding people, housing people, and keeping people healthy. These are the things you have to have before you can have opportunity in the world, and then you have to add education to that.
Mm-hmm. So you said, no, you were not an expert going into the field. What's the best way for founders then to learn? How did you learn about then the medical field, how it operates? How important is maybe the role of a co-founder to have a special deep domain co-founder or advisory board?
Well, with Newser, my co-founder was Michael Wolf, a journalist of longstanding. And with First Stop Health, I went back to one of my college friends again from the University of Chicago, Mark Friedman, who was an ER doc. And we started talking about this issue of how can we make medicine better. And so he helped me understand medicine in a way that I didn't. And so he's been our primary advisor and kind of helps us understand how doctors think about it. Because initially there was a lot of resistance, and some of it was economic, but a lot of it was like, I'm not sure you can treat somebody that way. Can you really treat somebody over the phone? Maybe if you had video. Well, video came along and there's still people who are skeptics. And now people are doing telemedicine via chat, which is kind of a back to the future kind of thing, where we went from phone to video to texting. But it works too. And it works particularly with certain demographics who that's the primary way in which they communicate. And so Mark was what made it possible. You can't be completely ignorant of an area, but what you want to do is not fall into the trap of becoming part of the broken part of the system. And so far we've avoided that.
Mm-hmm. Tell us very briefly, how did you then start Hoover? First Stop Health. No, when you said, okay, I want to fix the medical health space. I want to offer doctors on demand. How did you get it started? It's a two-sided platform or multi-sided platform, actually. No, you need the US licensed doctors. You need the companies or directly the patients that are willing to sign up for this. How did you start it?
Well, you first have to build the technology to deliver it. And so that's what we focused on initially. How do we create a platform that connects doctors and patients? And then first you need patients. So we went about selling patients. And because you need a certain amount of scale, we have to be able to treat people in 51 plus jurisdictions in the United States and in the US. You need to be licensed in each jurisdiction. There's a temporary suspension of that during COVID right now, but you need to be licensed in each jurisdiction to practice medicine in that jurisdiction. And so there are not many doctors who have 51 plus licenses. And so we rented somebody else's network. So they answered the medical calls for us. We paid them a fee for doing that. And then they were bought by Teladoc about 2 years in. and Teladoc sent us, they were perfectly within their rights to send us a termination note. I said, oh, could you give us a few more months? And they were very generous. They said yes. And we decided to create our own network at that point because we were large enough at that point to where we could hire, or it's all 1099 doctors, but get enough so that we could cover every state that we had patients in.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating as well, and how you used an existing network and so of doctors to get started. Because I imagine as well, many founders think that they have to build everything from scratch, and you as well know with the information I observed, you're looking for databases that are out there already, some, let's say, components, some information that you can use to then take to the market. Is that right? Would you say, is that a common theme as well, what you try to do, especially at the beginning, to see what's already out there that you can get started immediately with that asset in hand?
Yeah, so that's the way I've always worked, is try and lever third parties' expertise to do these things. I would say that in telemedicine in recent years, it's been entirely different. People, I think we raised $2.5 million in our first round at First Stop Health, and one of our competitors' first round was 80 million. And so they have the ability to hire doctors and get them licenses and not have to worry about whether they're making money on each one initially because they have a lot more capital. And that's a way, and to be honest, one of those companies is one of our competitors now, and they've been very successful. They do a great job, but it's not the way I like to work. I don't want to take a bunch of other people's money and figure out what to do with it, how to build this. And so we're a little bit more slow in terms of how we did it, but we're in the right place at the right time when COVID came along and this transformation of the American healthcare industry from on the order of less than 1% of everything was virtual care in 2019. Some estimates are that it will be 20% of all visits with physicians and other healthcare personnel will be virtual in 2021.
Mm-hmm. And you said somewhat slower. I think it's all relative because you made the Inc. 500 list of the fastest growing companies, I believe, twice in a row, right? So you guys are as well growing quite rapidly as well. And I think you have the leading utilization rate there, where I think is at around 50% now versus competition that's around about at 10% or something like that, or single digits even of their membership utilization. So it seems like you're doing a bunch of things that quite excitingly right. So we can see how through agreements, through licensing as well, or through a contractual agreement, you got access to the US doctors. How did you scale the distribution side? And because then now you needed the patients as well, the patient side.
So the primary way to sell any kind of benefit, whether it's a health benefit or something else, into corporate America is through brokers, and they're brokers that specialize in healthcare and benefits. Most of the large brokerage firms do that. There are half a dozen gigantic players in the space, and they keep consolidating. The largest one is Aon, and it just bought the second or the third largest one. And so one of the ways we have a sales force of 10 right now, but when we first started, it was 2. And one of the ways that you can multiply or magnify your efforts is that a broker will typically have several dozen clients that are using or could use telemedicine. And so if you can develop a relationship with a broker, you suddenly have access to, let's just say, 24 clients. And that's much easier than trying to call on those clients and convince them to work with you. Most of them will tell you anyway to go talk to our broker. And so what we found is in the middle market that we address, which is 500 employees to 10,000 employees, brokers were the best place to go. We couldn't go there immediately because they won't work with you unless you have a track record. So we had to spend a couple of years building a track record by selling directly. And then we were able to go to brokers. And in the mid-market, our primary competition is one of the other companies being embedded in the healthcare plan, being sold by being bought by an employer. So if you have Blue Cross, there is a telemedicine program that comes with it. I have it right now. I know that telemedicine provider, they do a very good job, but it's still in the old model. You're paying a $40 copay in order to get a telemedicine consult. One of the things where we distinguish ourselves is there is no copay, which takes down one of the big barriers for people trying something new. And so by not having a copay, we're charging the employer the amount of that copay. And what we do in return for the employer, so that they'll do that, is we guarantee them that they'll get an ROI. So if they're paying us $100,000 a year, we guarantee them that they'll save $125,000 a year from their self-insured plan in medical costs. And sometimes we don't quite make that guarantee, and we have to pay a small refund or credit. But most of the time, with 80 to 90%, more than 90%. This past year was different because it was so weird. But most of the time, that guarantee convinces them that this is a no-lose situation, and we're able to convince them to go with us, where we can deliver 40 or 50% utilization versus traditionally 1 to 2%. COVID changed everything. Even the 1 to 2% went up to 10% during COVID. So we went up to 93% during the height of COVID.
So we see as well, in the market, because oftentimes our people are scared if there are competitors in the market. Here we see gigantic competitors. You said it, how much money they raised just to get started, and there was more and more money put into these systems. Here you are as an entrepreneur, as well. And then, but you see, if you have a gigantic growing market, you can differentiate, and you told us some way how First Stop Health is differentiating that. Coming maybe a bit, stepping a few steps back and looking now, it's your fourth venture, you've learned a lot. What would you tell people who are thinking about starting their own companies? Is that a guiding concept or something very important that you say, after this journey of my fourth company, this kind of insight I'm using a lot every day almost, I'm using it, or it's one of my guiding models to help me decide things or so? Is there something like a core concept that you have?
Well, the first thing is you have to be enthusiastic about what you're doing. So I recall back in the .com days, there were an awful lot of people starting, you name it, .com. And I would say, well, why are you into delivering, garden supplies? Oh, we're not. We just think the demographics look good, aging population, they like to garden. And I said, well, do you have your own garden? No. And that company didn't work out. And so you have to have a degree of enthusiasm. I would say the mission that we have for First Stop Health, which is to deliver care that people love, and that means a delightful experience at every level. It means convenience, it means affordability, it means high quality, and it means a focus on what the patient really wants and needs. Also gives you a kind of second level of enthusiasm. So maybe you're enthusiastic about fixing healthcare, but when you actually can have a mission, which is to deliver care that people love, which is our mission statement, and then we have a set of values that go around that unites everybody and aligns everybody on what's important. So in most companies, salespeople care about sales, operations people care about operations. In our company, everybody on the management team, and to a certain extent, even below that, needs to care about all those things in order to make it work. And so I would say this combination of having a mission and being enthusiastic about whatever you're doing, the industry or the project, is important.
In terms of common mistakes that you see other people doing, because you as well, you're a very active business angel, or as well mistakes where you said, those I've done in my 4 ventures or over and over again, and I think I'm learning, but it seems like somehow I still keep repeating them. Is there a common one that you like to make people aware of also that you think is happening quite frequently?
It's all about the people in your company. I mean, everybody says that. It's almost trite to say it, but if your people aren't excited about what you're doing and about the mission, and you aren't treating them properly, then you're going to have a problem. So when I started Hoover's, I was working, I don't know, 80 hours a week, and I asked other people to work 80 hours a week. And I was just starting a family at the time. And I would say that was a big mistake to work 80 hours a week. I should have figured out how to cut that back. And so one of the things we really encourage work-life balance, and people work just as hard as if they were working 80 hours a week, and they're more efficient and they're happier. And so we measure our employees' happiness twice a year, and we ask them if they're not happy, why, and we essentially create a net promoter score. And I'm proud to say that on our last one, we had only one person who was a net detractor, and everybody else was a net promoter, and they've told us what they want. And there were two areas that kind of surprised me. One was they did not think that our family leave benefits were as generous as they should be. And we thought they were quite generous. And they said, we don't think that our community involvement is quite what it should be. So I essentially said, okay, the federal government in the United States has mandated 12 weeks of leave for men and women when there is a new member of the family that comes in, whether by birth or adoption or marriage or what have you. And so we adopted the same policy, even though I have to say a lot of people resisted giving it to men. I thought, no, men ought to be able to take the time off if they want to. And that was a huge hit. And then the second thing was we created a committee from the ground up. We said, anybody who'd like to start getting involved in community things, please come to this meeting. And then we appointed somebody in the company, not a manager, to run it. And so we're now involved in tutoring projects, food projects, a variety of other projects. And we've been able to maintain it even during COVID, where particularly we do an internship for young people who don't have very much experience in business, and we're able to help them via Zoom or whatever. And so those are two things that people felt were very important. And as a result, we went from having maybe 3 or 4 detractors to 1, and we have just, if you were to call it an NPS score, we'd be over 90%. So
that's wonderful. And I think it's a really great practice as well and it helps people to build these companies that they then know that where people are really enthusiastic and passionate to work on that. And it shows as well the full spectrum of things that are part of it, just as leave when you get kids, or as well then part to give back to the community in other ways. I think that's really fantastic. Patrick, your 4th venture, what would you say personally? What's the thing? What keeps you going? Kind of, because you could have said, maybe after the second already, that's for me. I'm I don't know. I travel actually to Spain. I sit at the coast. I travel to somewhere else. So I know you have a very international background growing up. What kept you going, and what's the thing that drives you to build the next venture, or in this case, to take First Stop Health now to the next level?
Well, I enjoy working. I mean, I'm not sure what I would do if I didn't have a mission. And so there's a now infamous line that Biden has used, and he stole it from Neil Kinnock in the UK. It's like, I am the first entrepreneur in 1,000 generations in my family. Everybody in my family was a preacher or a doctor or a bureaucrat. And I admire all of those professions, but somehow some genetic anomaly occurred to me, and I just love creating new things. And the way you measure new things is by how many of whatever it is you're trying to do, you can do. In our case, it's consults. That translates to dollars. That's how I'm able to raise money from folks. And but I love doing this, and the money side is kind of less and less important as you get some success. And so probably my next one will be not for profit as opposed to for profit.
Wonderful. That's so great to see, so inspiring. Patrick, thanks so much for taking the time and sharing all these insights, and all the best going forward.
Thank you, Jan. It's been a pleasure.